The Zentari cadet, whose name was Clicks according to the roster, bounced lightly on his feet as he faced Commander Thex. His forearms moved in complex patterns, each limb capable of independent action, while maintaining perfect coordination with the others. The natural advantage was obvious. While most species had to choose between offense and defense at any given moment, Zentari could simultaneously attack and block from multiple angles. Demonstrate your species' natural combat stance, Commander Thex instructed. Moving to a position about 10 feet away, Clicks immediately dropped into what Marcus recognized as a modified defensive posture. Two arms extended forward in a guard position, while the other two flanked wide, ready to intercept attacks from multiple directions. It was an impressive display of natural evolution's gift to his species. Excellent positioning, Thex acknowledged. Now maintain that stance while defending against my attacks. I will move at quarter speed to ensure safety. Even at reduced speed, Commander Thex was formidable. His first strike came as a straightforward thrust easily blocked by Clix's primary guard. But immediately following was a sweeping motion from the side that would have caught most two-armed species completely off guard. Clix's secondary arm intercepted it smoothly. The observation deck erupted in appreciative sounds from various species. The Zentari delegation made their species equivalent of applause, a rapid clicking of their secondary mouths that created a rhythmic percussion. Even the typically stoic Vex increased their harmonic humming to show approval. Notice, Commander Thex said while continuing his demonstration attacks, how natural advantages can be maximized through proper training. Raw ability means nothing without discipline. Marcus watched carefully as the demonstration continued. Thex gradually increased his speed and complexity, showing how an experienced warrior could challenge even naturally gifted opponents. Clicks was holding his own admirably, but Marcus could see the Zentari was starting to struggle. Four arms were an advantage, but they also required more complex coordination. Under pressure, that complexity could become a weakness. The final sequence was particularly impressive. Thex launched what appeared to be a coordinated three-point attack, high, low, and center simultaneously. For a moment it seemed impossible to defend against, but Clicks managed to block the high and center strikes while jumping to avoid the low sweep. The observation deck burst into enthusiastic approval. Well executed, Thex acknowledged as both fighters returned to neutral positions. Your species' natural gifts, properly trained, make you formidable opponents. Clicks practically glowed with pride as he returned to his seat among the other cadets. The Zentari delegation's clicking reached an almost thunderous level. Marcus couldn't help but smile at their enthusiasm. It was genuinely well-deserved praise. Now, Commander Thex announced, we will examine how different species adapt when facing opponents with superior natural advantages. He gestured toward the Krathen section. The Krathen possess natural armor that makes conventional attacks largely ineffective. How does one defeat an opponent you cannot harm? A particularly massive Krathen cadet stood up. Even among his well-armored species, he was impressive. His exoskeleton bore the deep blue coloration that indicated exceptional density, and the ceremonial scarring around his primary joints showed he had already seen real combat. Defensive advantages must be overcome through technique rather than force. Thex continued as the Krathen took position on the mat. Watch carefully. This demonstration was different from the first. Instead of testing the volunteers' abilities, Thex was showing how to overcome them. His attacks focused on joints where the exoskeleton naturally had flexibility gaps. His movements emphasized leverage and pressure points rather than impact force. The key, Thex explained while demonstrating a joint lock that made even the massive Krathen grimace, is understanding that every defense has weaknesses. Natural armor protects against many attacks but creates limitations in mobility and flexibility. The Krathen cadet found himself repeatedly off balance as Thex used his own mass against him. It was a masterful display of technique overcoming natural advantages. The observation deck watched in fascinated silence as their assumptions about superior species were challenged. After several minutes, Thex released the final hold and both fighters stepped back. Even the most formidable natural defenses can be overcome through knowledge and skill. The Krathen cadet nodded respectfully, though Marcus could see the embarrassment in his posture. Being outmaneuvered so thoroughly in front of peers from other species was clearly difficult to accept. This brings us to an important principle, Thex continued, his scales shifting to a more serious dark blue. In real combat, you will face opponents with advantages you do not possess. Superior technology, natural weapons, enhanced physiology. The warrior who survives is not necessarily the strongest or best equipped, but the most adaptable. Several cadets shifted uncomfortably. The implications were clear. Their natural advantages might not be enough when facing unknown threats. Adaptability, Thex emphasized, means using whatever tools are available, even if they are not ideal. Marcus felt dozens of eyes turning toward the human section. Here it comes, he thought. The obligatory lesson about making do with inferior equipment. Some species, Thex continued, his gaze settling on the humans, have built their entire survival strategy around adaptability rather than specialization. Commander Thex walked over to the weapons rack and began examining the various training implements. His three eyes evaluated each item with professional assessment. Purpose-built weapons will always be superior to improvised alternatives. However, situations arise where ideal equipment is not available. He picked up a standard combat staff, its surface gleaming with integrated technology. This weapon represents centuries of development. Balanced for multiple species use, reinforced with molecular bonding, equipped with energy amplification systems, the staff hummed with barely contained power as Thex activated its systems. Several cadets leaned forward, impressed by the weapon's obvious sophistication. Now, Thex said, setting the advanced staff aside, consider the alternative. His hand moved toward the forgotten mop handle tucked away in the corner of the rack. Marcus tensed slightly, knowing what was coming. Sometimes, Thex said, hefting the simple metal pole, this is all that is available. The contrast was stark. Where the combat staff was elegant and clearly engineered for warfare, the mop handle was purely utilitarian. Scratched, slightly bent, with absolutely no technological enhancements whatsoever. Any species attempting to use such a primitive implement against trained opponents would be at a severe disadvantage, Thex announced. The limitations are obvious. Marcus had heard enough variations of this lecture to recite it himself. Humans were clever. They made do with less, they improvised well, but they would always be limited by their inferior equipment and lack of natural weapons. Would any of the human cadets care to demonstrate these limitations? Thex asked, his tone polite but carrying an undertone that made it more command than request. Marcus looked at his fellow humans. Two were clearly hoping to avoid attention. One looked nervous and the fourth was actually sleeping. That left him. I'll volunteer, Commander, Marcus said, standing up. As he walked down to the training mat, Marcus could hear whispered conversations in a dozen different languages. The universal translation didn't catch everything, but the general sentiment was clear. This was going to be educational, but not in a good way for the human. Marcus took the mop handle from Commander Thex and hefted it experimentally. It was heavier than it looked, solid construction despite its humble origins. The balance was off compared to purpose-built weapons, but that wasn't necessarily a disadvantage if you knew how to work with it. The drill is simple, Commander Thex announced to the observation deck. Close combat demonstration with improvised weapons against trained opposition. Marcus smiled and settled into a ready stance. Simple indeed. The massive training hall buzzed with nervous energy as cadets from across the Galactic Defense Coalition gathered for their first close combat demonstration. Representatives from 12 different species filled the observation deck, their various forms creating a colorful tapestry of galactic diversity. The Zentari with their forearms twitched anxiously, while the crystalline Vex hummed in harmonious frequencies that translated to excitement. Commander Thex, a towering Gorvani with scales that shifted from blue to green when agitated, stood at the center of the training mat. His reputation preceded him throughout the galaxy, undefeated in over 300 combat scenarios, master of 17 different fighting disciplines, and instructor to some of the most elite warriors in known space. His three eyes scanned the crowd with practiced efficiency. Today, his voice boomed through the hall's translation systems. You will witness proper close-quarters combat technique. Each species brings unique advantages to battle, but discipline and training separate warriors from casualties. The human contingent sat quietly in one corner of the observation area. There were only 5 of them among the 200 cadets present, a small representation from the newest species to join the coalition. Most other species still viewed humans with curiosity rather than respect. After all, they had no natural armor like the Krathen, no multiple limbs like the Zentari, no energy projection abilities like the Luminari. They were relatively small, possessed only 2 eyes, and their bone density was considered laughably weak by galactic standards. Marcus Chen sat among his fellow humans, watching Commander Thex demonstrate a series of defensive maneuvers against a practice dummy. The movements were precise, calculated, and devastatingly effective. Each strike would have been lethal against most species. Marcus had been studying various galactic combat forms since joining the Coalition 6 months ago, fascinated by how different species approached warfare. The key to survival, Commander Thex continued, executing a perfect joint lock that would have snapped most beings' appendages, is understanding your opponent's capabilities while maximizing your own natural advantages. A Zentari cadet raised one of his 4 hands. Commander, what about species with limited natural weapons? How do they adapt? Thex's scales shifted slightly toward green, indicating mild amusement. An excellent question. Some species must rely more heavily on technology and strategy. His gaze swept over the human section. Though every species has evolved some form of combat capability, even if it appears modest. Several cadets chuckled, particularly the Krathen, whose exoskeletons could deflect most handheld weapons. Marcus felt his jaw tighten slightly but maintained his composure. He had heard similar comments throughout his training, always delivered with just enough politeness to avoid being outright insulting. Commander Thex gestured toward a rack of training weapons along the wall. Combat scenarios rarely allow for ideal conditions. Sometimes warriors must improvise with whatever materials are available. He selected a gleaming plasma blade, its energy field crackling with deadly potential. But proper weapons designed for combat will always be superior to makeshift alternatives. The demonstration continued as Thex showed various techniques with different weapons. His movements were a masterclass in efficiency and lethality. The plasma blade hummed through the air in perfect arcs while his defensive maneuvers with an energy shield demonstrated why he had never been defeated. Each technique was explained in detail, with emphasis on how different species could adapt the movements to their physiology. Remember, Thex said, deactivating the plasma blade. In real combat, hesitation means death. Your weapon becomes an extension of your body, and your body becomes a weapon itself. A young luminary cadet, her bioluminescent patterns flickering with nervousness, asked, Commander, what if someone doesn't have access to proper weapons? Then they use whatever is available, though the results are typically unfortunate. Thex's 3 eyes scanned the crowd again. Improvised weapons are for desperate situations only. They lack the balance, durability, and lethality of purpose-built combat tools. Marcus noticed several cadets glancing in his direction. Humans had gained a reputation for improvisation out of necessity. Since their technology was still decades behind most coalition species, it wasn't necessarily meant as an insult, but the implication was clear. Advanced species didn't need to improvise because they had superior equipment. Who would like to volunteer for a demonstration? Thex asked, his scales now shifting toward a more neutral blue-gray. Several hands shot up immediately. The Zentari who had asked the earlier question practically bounced in his seat with enthusiasm. A particularly large Krathen cadet stood up, his exoskeleton gleaming under the training hall's lights. Even a few of the typically reserved Vex began harmonizing in what their species considered eager volunteering. Commander Thex surveyed the volunteers with practiced assessment. You, he pointed to the enthusiastic Zentari, will demonstrate basic defensive postures against multiple attack vectors. The chosen cadet practically flew down to the training mat, his forearms already moving through warm-up exercises. The other volunteers settled back into their seats, some disappointed but most relieved. Sparring with Commander Thex, even in a controlled demonstration, was not something most cadets were truly prepared for. As the Zentari cadet took his position on the mat, Marcus found himself studying the training weapons rack more carefully. Most of the equipment was designed for specific species. Plasma weapons for those who could handle the energy feedback, kinetic weapons for those with sufficient strength, defensive tools sized for various physiologies. There were even a few items he couldn't immediately identify. probably designed for species physiology he wasn't familiar with yet. But tucked away in one corner of the rack, almost as an afterthought, were some basic training implements, a few practice staffs, some weighted clubs, and what appeared to be a simple mop handle that someone had forgotten to remove after cleaning. It was unremarkable in every way, just a plain metal pole about 5 feet long with a slight bend from use and a few scuff marks from being moved around. Marcus smiled slightly to himself. Sometimes the most unremarkable things turned out to be the most useful. The demonstration was about to begin, and Commander Thex was about to learn something new about human adaptability. Commander Thex circled Marcus slowly, his 3 eyes analyzing every aspect of the human's stance. To most observers, Marcus appeared small and inadequately armed. The mop handle looked particularly pitiful, compared to the advanced weapons Thex had demonstrated earlier. Several cadets in the observation deck were already whispering predictions about how quickly this demonstration would end. Standard engagement protocols, Thex announced. I will begin with basic attacks to show the limitations of improvised weapons against proper technique. Marcus nodded, adjusting his grip on the metal pole. He had spent considerable time studying galactic combat forms, but more importantly, he had grown up practicing human martial arts before ever leaving Earth. His grandfather had been obsessed with historical fighting techniques, and Marcus had learned everything from European longsword fighting to Filipino stick combat to Japanese staff techniques. The first attack came exactly as Marcus expected, a HFY straightforward thrust designed to test basic defensive capabilities. Thex moved at the same quarter speed he had used with the Zentari cadet, clearly intending to demonstrate rather than actually challenge his opponent. Marcus deflected the attack with a simple parry, redirecting Thex's force rather than trying to stop it directly. The movement was economical and effective, though hardly impressive to the watching cadets. Adequate, Thex acknowledged. Basic defensive techniques can be adapted to any weapon. The second attack was slightly more complex, a combination thrust and withdrawal designed to draw the defender forward into a counterattack. It was a classic technique taught in most galactic combat academies. Instead of falling for the feint, Marcus stepped offline and used the mop handle to guide Thex's weapon past him. The movement was smooth and looked almost effortless, though Marcus could see surprise flicker across Thex's scaled features. Interesting adaptation, Thex said, his scales shifting slightly toward green. However, improvised weapons have significant limitations when facing multiple attack vectors. The next sequence was considerably more aggressive. Thex began chaining attacks together, forcing Marcus to defend continuously rather than having time to set up counterattacks. It was the same technique he had used to gradually overwhelm the Zentari cadet, building pressure until mistakes became inevitable. Marcus found himself working harder. But something interesting was happening. The mop handle's unconventional balance was actually becoming an advantage. Where a proper weapon would have specific timing and distance requirements, the simple metal pole could be used effectively at any range. Short grips for close work, long grips for distance, and everything in between. More importantly, Thex was fighting according to established galactic combat doctrine. His techniques were flawless examples of accepted practices, which meant they were predictable to someone who had studied them extensively. Marcus began incorporating techniques that weren't part of standard galactic training. A sudden shift to half-sorting grip caught Thex off guard. A spinning movement that would have been impossible with most high-tech weapons created an opening that hadn't existed seconds before. The human is adapting. Well, came a whispered comment from the observation. Deck Thex increased his speed, moving beyond the quarter pace he had maintained for the previous demonstrations. His attacks became more varied and unpredictable, designed to overwhelm opponents who relied too heavily on pattern recognition. But Marcus was no longer just defending. He began testing Thex's responses, probing for weaknesses in the commander's technique. The mop handle snaked through attack patterns, sometimes blocking, sometimes redirecting, occasionally striking back with quick, economical movements. The observation deck grew quieter as cadets realized this wasn't going according to the expected script. The human wasn't being overwhelmed by superior technique and equipment. If anything, he seemed to be getting more comfortable as the engagement continued. Impressive, Thex acknowledged, stepping back momentarily. Your species' adaptability is noteworthy. Marcus could hear the slight tension in the commander's voice. This was supposed to be a demonstration of human limitations, not capabilities. However, Thex continued, his scales now showing definite green agitation. Improvised weapons cannot match purpose-built implements in sustained combat. Thex retrieved his preferred plasma blade from the weapons rack, its energy field crackling to life with barely contained power. The contrast was stark. Advanced technology versus a simple metal pole that someone had forgotten to remove after cleaning. Now we will see the true limitations of primitive equipment, Thex announced to the observation deck. The first attack with the plasma blade was revelatory. The weapon's energy field extended several inches beyond the physical blade, making distance calculations more complex. It also generated enough heat to be felt several feet away, and the humming energy field created subtle psychological pressure. Marcus immediately adjusted his tactics. The mop handle couldn't directly block the plasma blade. The energy field would cut through metal like it wasn't there. Instead, he focused on staying outside the weapon's effective range while looking for openings. Thex pressed his advantage, using the plasma blade's superior reach and cutting power to drive Marcus backward across the training mat. Several cadets began nodding approvingly. This was more like what they had expected to see. But Marcus wasn't retreating randomly. He was drawing Thex toward a specific area of the training mat, where the lighting created subtle shadows. More importantly, he was studying the plasma blade's energy patterns, looking for the tiny gaps between energy field pulses that all such weapons possessed. The opening came when Thex committed to a particularly aggressive overhead strike. For just a moment, the plasma blade's energy field cycled down to prevent overheating. Marcus stepped inside the weapon's reach and brought the mop handle up in a rising strike that caught Thex completely off guard. The impact wasn't designed to cause damage. This was still a training demonstration, but it clearly connected, and Commander Thex staggered backward with genuine surprise written across his scaled features. The observation deck erupted in shocked murmurs. A few cadets actually stood up to get a better view, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Lucky strike, Thex muttered, though his scales were now showing definite yellow patterns that indicated serious agitation. Perhaps, Marcus replied politely. Should we continue? Thex's response was to launch into the most aggressive sequence yet. His plasma blade became a blur of deadly energy, creating attack patterns that would have challenged any warrior in the galaxy. The weapon's advanced systems automatically adjusted for optimal striking angles and energy output. Marcus found himself working harder than he had since arriving at the Coalition Academy. The plasma blade's reach and power forced him to rely entirely on mobility and timing. One mistake would end the demonstration immediately, but something else was happening. The mop handle, stressed by repeated impacts with the plasma blade's energy field, was beginning to show signs of damage. Small stress fractures appeared along its length, and the metal was heating up from energy absorption. The weapon was breaking down under conditions it was never designed to handle, just as everyone had predicted. Marcus glanced at the growing cracks and smiled. Sometimes the most useful things happened when equipment reached its limits. The stress fractures in the mop handle were spreading rapidly. What had started as hairline cracks were now visible gaps that ran nearly a third of the way through the metal pole. Each time Marcus deflected or redirected one of Thex's plasma blade strikes, the improvised weapon absorbed energy it was never designed to handle. Commander Thex noticed the deterioration and pressed his advantage harder. His attacks became more frequent and powerful, designed to accelerate the weapon's breakdown. The plasma blade's energy field crackled with increased intensity as he pushed the weapon's output beyond normal training parameters. Observe, Thex called out to the watching cadets while maintaining his assault. How improvised weapons fail under real combat stress. Primitive materials cannot withstand advanced weaponry. Several cadets nodded appreciatively. This was exactly the lesson they had expected to learn. The human had performed better than anticipated, but ultimately, superior technology would prevail. Marcus could feel the mop handle vibrating with each impact. The metal was heating up to the point where maintaining a proper grip was becoming difficult. Soon he would have to either abandon the weapon or risk serious burns to his hands. But instead of looking concerned, Marcus was calculating angles and timing. The fractures weren't random. They were following the metal's grain structure and stress patterns. More importantly, they were creating a weakness that could be exploited if used correctly. Thex launched another series of rapid strikes, each one designed to overwhelm Marcus's defensive capabilities. The plasma blade hummed through complex attack patterns that showcased the commander's masterful technique. Energy fields traced deadly arcs through the air, and the weapon's advanced targeting systems provided feedback that enhanced accuracy and power. Marcus defended desperately, the damaged mop handle barely deflecting each strike. To the observers, it looked like he was moments away from being completely overwhelmed. The weapon in his hands was clearly failing, and he appeared to be running out of options. Then something unexpected happened. During a particularly aggressive overhead strike from Thex, Marcus stepped into the attack instead of away from it. The movement was so sudden and counterintuitive that it caught everyone off guard. Instead of trying to block the plasma blade directly, he used the mop handle to redirect its path while positioning himself inside Thex's effective striking range. The commander, committed to his attack and confident in his advantage, found himself in an awkward position. His weapon was designed for medium-range combat, not close-quarters grappling. For a moment, both fighters were locked in an almost intimate combat distance where technique mattered more than equipment. Marcus hooked one end of the increasingly damaged mop handle behind Thex's leading leg while simultaneously pushing against his center of gravity with the other end. It was a basic leverage technique that had nothing to do with weapons and everything to do with physics and biomechanics. Commander Thex, despite his superior strength and combat experience, found himself off balance. His three eyes widened in surprise as he stumbled backward, the plasma blade's targeting systems unable to compensate for his compromised position. The observation deck erupted in shocked exclamations. Several cadets stood up to get a better view, unable to believe that the supposedly outmatched human had managed to put the legendary Commander Thex at a disadvantage. "Impossible," muttered a Krathan cadet, his exoskeleton plates shifting nervously. But Marcus wasn't finished. As Thex recovered from the unexpected takedown attempt, Marcus deliberately struck the most damaged section of the mop handle against the edge of the training mat. The metal, already weakened by repeated energy absorption, snapped cleanly in half with a sharp crack that echoed through the training hall. Suddenly, instead of one weapon, Marcus held two shorter implements. Each piece was roughly 2 feet long, perfectly sized for dual-wielding techniques that weren't possible with a single long staff. The change in dynamics was immediate and dramatic. Where before Marcus had been limited to techniques suitable for a staff weapon, he now had the flexibility of dual weapons. More importantly, the break had occurred along optimal lines, creating two pieces with excellent balance and handling characteristics. Thex hesitated for a crucial moment, his tactical assessment system struggling to adapt to the sudden change in his opponent's capabilities. His training had prepared him for various weapon combinations, but improvised dual weapons created by deliberately breaking a single implement wasn't covered in any manual. Marcus pressed the advantage immediately. The twin pieces of the former mop handle moved in rapid, coordinated patterns that drew heavily from human dual-weapon fighting traditions. Techniques from Filipino eskrima blended seamlessly with concepts from European rapier and dagger combat. The shortened weapons were actually superior for this type of fighting. Their reduced length made them faster and more maneuverable, while the dual-wielding approach created multiple attack and defense vectors that were difficult to counter with a single weapon. Commander Thex found himself defending against attack patterns he had never encountered before. His plasma blade, formidable against single weapons, was less effective against rapidly moving dual implements that could attack from multiple angles simultaneously. "The human is using combat techniques not found in any galactic database," observed a Vex cadet, their harmonic humming shifting to frequencies that indicated confusion and interest. More importantly, the broken weapons were no longer absorbing energy from the plasma blade. The shortened length meant that Marcus could use them for striking and defensive work without direct contact with the energy field. Instead of trying to match technology with primitive materials, he was using mobility and technique to avoid the technological disadvantage entirely. The rhythm of the combat changed completely. Where before it had been a contest between advanced weaponry and primitive improvisation, it was now a display of tactical adaptability that showcased everything the Coalition claimed to value in its warriors. Thex attempted to regain control through sheer aggression, increasing his attack speed and power output. But the dual weapons gave Marcus options that hadn't existed moments before. He could block with one weapon while striking with the other, create complex defensive patterns that were nearly impossible to penetrate, and transition between offense and defense without the delays inherent in single-weapon fighting. The observation deck had grown completely silent except for the occasional whispered translation between species. This wasn't what anyone had expected to see. Commander Thex appears to be having difficulty, noted a luminary cadet, her bioluminescent patterns flickering with nervous energy. That was an understatement. For the first time in over 300 combat scenarios, Commander Thex was genuinely struggling against an opponent. The human's adaptability had turned what should have been a demonstration of human limitations into something entirely different. Marcus could see the frustration building in Thex's movements. The commander's scales were now showing deep yellow patterns mixed with angry red, a combination that indicated both agitation and wounded pride. Enough, Thex declared, stepping back from the engagement. The demonstration has served its purpose. But Marcus wasn't quite ready to end things. He had one more lesson to teach. Actually, Commander, Marcus said politely, I think there's one more important principle we should demonstrate. Thex's scales shifted to an even deeper shade of angry red. His three eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made several cadets in the observation deck shift uncomfortably. This was clearly not how the demonstration was supposed to proceed. The principles have been adequately covered, Thex replied, his voice carrying undertones that the translation systems rendered as barely controlled irritation. Marcus held up the two pieces of the broken mop handle, examining them as if seeing them for the first time. But we haven't really explored the concept of turning disadvantages into advantages. The observation deck was completely silent now. Every cadet, regardless of species, was focused on the exchange between the human and the legendary commander. This had moved far beyond a simple training demonstration. You see, Marcus continued, when most people think about weapons breaking, they consider it a failure. The equipment has reached its limits and can no longer function as designed. He tossed one of the metal pieces into the air and caught it smoothly. But sometimes when something breaks in exactly the right way, it becomes more useful than it was before. Commander Thex's posture suggested he was ready to end this demonstration by force if necessary. His grip on the plasma blade had tightened, and his stance indicated preparation for immediate attack. Human cadet, Thex said formally, you will return to your position in the observation area. This demonstration is concluded. Of course, Commander, Marcus replied. But first let me show everyone something really interesting about human combat philosophy. Without warning, Marcus snapped into motion. But instead of attacking Thex directly, he threw both pieces of the broken mop handle simultaneously, one high, one low, creating crossing trajectories that forced Thex to choose which one to intercept. Thex, reacting with trained instincts, moved to block the lower projectile while tracking the higher one with his peripheral vision. It was the tactically sound response, prioritizing the threat to his center mass while maintaining awareness of the secondary danger. But Marcus wasn't where Thex expected him to be. Instead of remaining at distance where the thrown weapons would provide cover for an attack, Marcus had moved laterally and was now approaching from an angle that Thex's defensive posture couldn't immediately address. More importantly, he was no longer armed with anything that looked like a conventional weapon. The truth was, Marcus had palmed something during his examination of the broken mop handle pieces, a small fragment of metal that had chipped off during the break. It was barely 2 inches long and completely unremarkable, the kind of debris that would normally be swept up and discarded. But in the right hands, even debris could be dangerous. Marcus's target wasn't Thex himself, but the plasma blade's power coupling, a small but critical component that regulated the weapon's energy flow. It was heavily shielded under normal circumstances, but Thex's defensive movement had exposed it for a fraction of a second. The metal fragment struck the coupling with perfect precision. There was a bright flash as the plasma blade's containment field destabilized, followed by an electronic whine as safety systems engaged to prevent a catastrophic overload. Commander Thex found himself holding a powerless weapon handle, staring at a human who had just demonstrated something that wasn't supposed to be possible. Equipment failure, Marcus announced cheerfully. It happens to everyone eventually. The silence in the observation deck was deafening. Several cadets were standing now, unable to believe what they had witnessed. The legendary Commander Thex, undefeated in over 300 combat scenarios, had been disarmed by a piece of broken cleaning equipment. How? Asked a Zentari cadet, all four of his arms gesturing in confusion. Marcus retrieved the two pieces of the mop handle from where they had landed after being thrown. Simple physics, really. Every technology has vulnerabilities, especially when it's designed to very specific parameters. He held up the metal fragment that had disabled the plasma blade. This little piece of debris was accelerated to exactly the right velocity to disrupt the weapon's power coupling. The plasma blade's own defensive systems did the rest. Commander Thex was examining his disabled weapon with growing disbelief. The damage was minimal, just a tiny dent in the power coupling's housing. But it had been precisely placed to cause maximum disruption with minimal force. You studied my weapon? Thex realized. I studied everything, Marcus replied. Your fighting style, your preferred techniques, your equipment specifications, even your species' physiological responses to stress. He gestured toward the observation deck. Everyone here has natural advantages. Extra arms, armor, energy projection abilities, enhanced strength. But they also have predictable limitations based on those same advantages. Marcus set down the broken mop handle pieces and faced the assembled cadets. Humans don't have those natural gifts. We're small, relatively weak, and we don't have any special abilities. But that means we're also not limited by the assumptions that come with natural advantages. A Luminari cadet raised her hand tentatively. But surely advanced technology negates those disadvantages. Does it? Marcus asked. Commander Thex had the most advanced weapon available. Decades of training, superior strength and speed, and complete confidence in his abilities. I had a piece of cleaning equipment that someone forgot to put away. He picked up one of the mop handle pieces again. But here's the thing about advanced technology. The more sophisticated it is, the more complex failure points it has. And the more confident you are in your equipment, the less likely you are to adapt when it fails. Commander Thex had been silent during this exchange, but now his scales were shifting toward a more thoughtful blue-gray color. You deliberately broke your weapon to create dual implements. The weapon was already failing, Marcus corrected. I just chose when and how it failed. Thex's three eyes studied Marcus with new respect. You allowed me to damage your weapon deliberately. I encouraged you to damage it in a specific way, Marcus clarified. There's a difference. You were fighting according to established doctrine, trying to overwhelm inferior equipment with superior force. I was fighting according to human doctrine, turn every disadvantage into an advantage. The observation deck buzzed with quiet conversations as cadets tried to process what they had witnessed. This wasn't just an upset victory. It was a complete reversal of everything they thought they understood about combat effectiveness. But the risks, protested a Krathan cadet. What if the weapon had broken incorrectly? Marcus shrugged. Then I would have adapted to whatever pieces I ended up with. That's what humans do. We work with what we have, not what we wish we had. Commander Thex set down his disabled plasma blade and walked over to examine the broken mop handle pieces more closely. His scales were now showing patterns that indicated deep thought rather than anger. You knew my weapon's vulnerabilities before the demonstration. Began, he stated, I know every weapon's vulnerabilities, Marcus replied. It's part of basic human military training. When you can't match your enemy's technology, you have to understand it better than they do. He picked up the small metal fragment that had disabled the plasma blade. This little piece of debris represents something important about human philosophy. We don't see failure as the end of usefulness. We see it as the beginning of new possibilities. The truth was starting to dawn on many of the cadets. The human hadn't won through superior skill or equipment. He had won through a completely different approach to problem solving that none of them had anticipated. Your species approaches combat like engineering problems, observed a Vex cadet, their harmonic frequency shifting to indicate understanding. Every challenge is an engineering problem, Marcus agreed. The question isn't whether you have the best tools, it's whether you can use whatever tools are available more effectively than your opponent expects, Commander. Thex straightened to his full impressive height, his scales now showing the neutral blue-gray that indicated acceptance rather than anger. This demonstration has revealed significant gaps in standard coalition combat doctrine. The admission sent shockwaves through the observation deck. Commander Thex was essentially acknowledging that human military philosophy had exposed weaknesses in galactic strategic thinking. Perhaps, Thex continued, there is value in studying unconventional approaches to warfare. Marcus nodded respectfully. Every species brings unique perspectives to the coalition. Humans contribute adaptability and unconventional problem-solving, but we're not trying to replace established doctrine. We're trying to expand it. He gestured toward the various cadets in the observation area. The Zentari have natural advantages in multi-vector combat. The Krathen bring defensive capabilities that are unmatched. The Luminari can coordinate in ways that other species can barely comprehend. All of these strengths make the coalition more effective. Marcus picked up both pieces of the broken mop handle. But sometimes you need someone who sees a broken cleaning tool and thinks dual weapons instead of equipment failure. The demonstration was clearly over, but its implications were just beginning to sink in. This hadn't been a simple training exercise. It had been a fundamental challenge to basics. The following morning brought unexpected changes to the Coalition Academy's training schedule. Instead of the standard tactical lectures, all cadets received notifications directing them to Emergency Assembly, Hall 7, a facility normally reserved for crisis briefings and high-level strategic discussions. Marcus arrived to find the hall buzzing with nervous energy. Cadets from all species were clustered in their usual groups, but the conversations were different from the typical academy gossip. Everyone was discussing the previous day's demonstration, and theories about what it meant were spreading through the cadet population like wildfire. The Zentari delegation was particularly animated, their forearmed gestures creating complex patterns as they debated tactical implications. The Krathen cadets stood in their characteristic defensive formation, but their normally confident posture seemed subdued. Even the usually serene Vex were harmonizing in frequencies that suggested confusion and uncertainty. Chen called out Clix, the Zentari cadet who had demonstrated with Commander Thex the day before. He bounded over with typical forearmed enthusiasm. Is it true that human military doctrine includes equipment destruction as a tactical option? Marcus smiled diplomatically. We prefer to call it adaptive resource utilization. But you deliberately damaged your weapon, pressed a nearby Luminari cadet, her bioluminescent patterns flickering with curiosity. That goes against every principle of equipment maintenance we've been taught. Sometimes the best way to maintain operational effectiveness is to sacrifice equipment preservation, Marcus replied. It depends on the situation. The conversations were interrupted by the arrival of several high-ranking officers. Marcus recognized Commander Thex, but there were others he had never seen before, species he couldn't immediately identify, wearing insignia that indicated very high positions within the coalition hierarchy. At the center of the group was an imposing figure that commanded immediate attention. She was clearly Arconian, one of the elder species that had founded the coalition centuries ago. Her crystalline exoskeleton shifted through subtle color patterns that indicated both authority and deep contemplation. Most cadets had never seen an Arconian in person, as they rarely involved themselves in day-to-day academy operations. Cadets, her voice resonated through translation systems with harmonics that conveyed absolute authority. Yesterday's demonstration has raised questions that require immediate attention. The hall fell completely silent. Emergency assemblies were rare, and having them presided over by Arconian leadership was almost unprecedented. The coalition has maintained strategic doctrine based on technological superiority and species specialization for over 4 centuries, she continued. This approach has served us well against conventional threats. Marcus felt dozens of eyes turning toward him. It was becoming clear that his improvised demonstration had generated consequences far beyond simple academy training. However, the Arconian continued, recent analysis suggests that our reliance on established doctrine may have created vulnerabilities we had not previously considered. She gestured toward Commander Thex, who stepped forward with noticeable reluctance. His scales were showing patterns that Marcus had learned indicated professional embarrassment, mixed with grudging respect, Commander. Thex will brief you on the strategic implications of yesterday's events. Thex activated a holographic display that showed tactical analysis data. Coalition combat doctrine assumes that advanced weaponry provides decisive advantages over primitive alternatives. This assumption has been challenged. The display showed detailed breakdowns of the previous day's demonstration, analyzing every movement and decision point. Marcus was surprised to see how thoroughly the encounter had been recorded and studied. Human Cadet Chen employed techniques that are not covered in any coalition training manual, Thex continued. More significantly, these techniques proved effective against standard coalition combat protocols. A Krathan cadet raised his massive arm. But surely one demonstration doesn't invalidate centuries of proven doctrine. One demonstration doesn't, agreed the Arconian, her crystalline features shifting to more serious color patterns. However, analysis of human historical combat records reveals systematic use of similar tactics across multiple conflicts and technological periods. The holographic display changed to show data that Marcus recognized from human military history, battle analyses from Earth's various conflicts, tactical studies from the colonial expansion period, and strategic assessments from humanity's first contact with galactic civilization. Human military philosophy appears to be fundamentally different from all other coalition species, Thex explained. Where we specialize in maximizing natural advantages, humans specialize in negating enemy advantages through unconventional approaches. Marcus watched his fellow cadets processing this information. Many were clearly struggling with concepts that challenged their basic understanding of warfare and technology. The implications are troubling, the Arconian continued. If human tactics can neutralize our technological advantages, what happens when we face enemies who have studied human methods? That question sent a chill through the assembled cadets. The coalition's military superiority was built on the assumption that advanced technology would always triumph over primitive alternatives. If that assumption was wrong, their entire strategic framework needed reconsideration. Therefore, the Arconian announced, the Coalition Academy will be implementing immediate changes to training protocols. The holographic display shifted to show new course schedules and training requirements. Marcus scanned the information with growing amazement. All cadets will receive instruction in adaptive combat techniques, improvised weapon usage, and unconventional tactical thinking, Thex read from the display. Additionally, human military advisors will be integrated into all advanced training programs. Several cadets exchanged nervous glances. Being taught by humans was a significant departure from coalition tradition, where instruction typically came from the most technologically advanced species. Human Cadet Chen. The Arconian addressed Marcus directly. You will be transferred to the Advanced Strategic Development Program. Effective immediately. Marcus felt his stomach drop. The Advanced Strategic Development Program was legendary within the Coalition, a highly classified initiative that dealt with threats too sensitive for normal military channels. Graduates typically disappeared into intelligence services or special operations units that didn't officially exist. Ma'am, I'm not sure I'm qualified for that level of responsibility, Marcus said carefully. The Arconian's crystalline features shifted to what might have been amusement. Yesterday you defeated one of our most experienced instructors using a piece of cleaning equipment. Today you're concerned about qualifications? Several cadets chuckled nervously, but the underlying tension remained. This wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about fundamental changes to how the Coalition approached warfare and technology. The galaxy is becoming more dangerous, the Arconian continued, her tone growing more serious. We face enemies who do not follow conventional tactical doctrine. Our traditional advantages may not be sufficient against threats that think as unconventionally as humans do. She paused, allowing that sobering thought to sink in among the cadets. Therefore, we must learn to think like humans, and that means learning from humans. The assembly continued for another hour, outlining the new training requirements and strategic initiatives, but Marcus barely heard the details. His mind was racing through the implications of what had just happened. A simple training demonstration with a broken mop handle had just changed the course of galactic military doctrine. That wasn't something he had ever intended or expected. As the cadets filed out of the assembly hall, Marcus found himself surrounded by classmates who wanted to understand what had really happened the day before. But he was beginning to realize that even he didn't fully understand the consequences of his actions. The broken mop handle had done more than win a training demonstration. It had broken something much more significant. 6 months later, Marcus stood in a very different kind of training facility. The Advanced Strategic Development Program operated from a classified station deep in Coalition space, where the brightest military minds from across the galaxy worked on problems that kept senior commanders awake at night. The facility bore little resemblance to the Academy's sterile training halls. Here, the emphasis was on real-world application rather than theoretical perfection. Equipment was deliberately mismatched. Scenarios were designed to be unsolvable using conventional doctrine, and failure was considered a learning opportunity rather than a mark of shame. Marcus's current assignment involved training a mixed-species team in unconventional tactics. His students included a Zentari Special Operations veteran, a Krathan Siege specialist, 2 Luminari intelligence operatives, and a Vex strategic analyst. All of them outranked him significantly, and all of them had initially been skeptical about learning from the newest Coalition species. "Today's exercise is simple," Marcus announced to his assembled team. "You need to infiltrate a heavily defended installation and retrieve classified information. You have no advanced technology, no species-specific advantages, and the enemy knows you're coming." The Zentari operative, a grizzled warrior named Vexkorth, gestured with all 4 arms in frustration. "How is this supposed to be possible? Without proper equipment, this is a suicide mission." Marcus smiled and picked up a collection of ordinary objects from a nearby table. Cleaning supplies, maintenance tools, broken electronic components, and various pieces of debris that most people would consider garbage. "These are your resources," he announced. The Krathan Siege specialist, whose armor bore scars from actual combat, examined the collection with obvious disdain. "Cleaning supplies cannot breach fortified positions, can't they?" Marcus asked. "Commander Krath, what do you know about industrial cleaning compounds?" Krath's armored features shifted slightly as he accessed his species' extensive technical databases. "They are designed to break down molecular bonds in organic and metallic substances, and if you concentrate them, they become corrosive." Understanding began to dawn in Krath's eyes. "Potentially dangerously so," Marcus nodded approvingly. "Maintenance access routes, ventilation systems, structural support joints, all vulnerable to chemical degradation if you know what you're doing." One of the Luminary operatives, her bioluminescent patterns flickering with interest, picked up a broken circuit board, standard electronic components. "But the rare earth elements could be extracted and repurposed." "For what?" asked the Vex analyst, his harmonic frequencies indicating curiosity. "Signal generation, electromagnetic interference, even primitive explosive devices if you know the right chemical combinations," the Luminary replied, her patterns now cycling through rapid sequences that indicated excitement. Marcus watched his team beginning to understand the fundamental shift in thinking that human tactics required. Instead of seeing limitations, they were starting to see possibilities. "The key principle," Marcus explained, "is that every environment contains everything you need to complete your mission. You just have to see it differently." Over the following hours, Marcus guided his team through increasingly complex scenarios. They learned to turn security systems against themselves, use maintenance infrastructure as infiltration routes, and transform everyday objects into tactical advantages. But more importantly, they learned to think like humans, to see opportunity where others saw obstacles, and to find strength in apparent weakness. The exercise culminated in a full-scale simulation against a defensive position manned by some of the Coalition's best conventional forces. Marcus's team had only their improvised equipment and unconventional tactics against opponents with advanced weaponry and numerical superiority. The results surprised everyone, including Marcus. His team didn't just complete the mission, they accomplished it so efficiently that the defending forces never realized they had been infiltrated until the simulation ended. Chemical compounds had compromised structural integrity in exactly the right places. Improvised electronic devices had created false sensor readings, and creative use of maintenance systems had provided access routes that hadn't appeared on any defensive plan. "Impossible," muttered the simulation controller, a veteran Arconian strategist who had designed the exercise to be unsolvable. "The defensive position was impregnable using conventional assault methods." "That's why we didn't use conventional methods," replied Vexkorth, his forearms now moving in patterns that indicated satisfaction rather than frustration. Marcus's success in the Advanced Strategic Development Program had not gone unnoticed by coalition leadership. The techniques he taught were being integrated into special operations training across all member species. More significantly, human tactical advisors were being assigned to every major coalition military unit. The changes went beyond simple training programs. Coalition engineers were redesigning equipment to be more adaptable and less dependent on specific technological solutions. Strategic doctrine was being rewritten to account for unconventional threats and non-standard tactical approaches. But perhaps most importantly, the coalition was learning to value perspectives that didn't fit traditional patterns. Species that had been considered militarily insignificant because they lacked obvious natural advantages were being reevaluated for their unique contributions to strategic thinking. Marcus often thought about that. Simple training demonstration with Commander Thex, a broken mop handle had started a revolution in galactic military thinking that was still expanding throughout coalition space. His communication device chimed with an incoming priority message. The sender identification made him pause. It was from the coalition high command itself. Strategic Advisor Chen, the message began, using his new official title. Your presence is requested for immediate consultation. We have encountered a threat that does not respond to conventional tactical approaches. Your expertise in adaptive strategy is required urgently. Marcus smiled as he prepared to respond to the summons. Somewhere in the galaxy, there was probably an enemy that thought they had the coalition figured out. They had superior technology, better weapons, and more advanced tactics. They were about to learn what every opponent of humanity eventually discovered: that humans didn't fight fair, didn't follow the rules, and could turn any disadvantage into a weapon. The drill was simple, really. Take whatever the enemy gave you, break it if necessary, and use the pieces to win in ways they never expected. After all, that's what humans did best. As Marcus gathered his equipment and prepared to leave for his new assignment, he made sure to pack one essential item, a simple metal pole, identical to the mop handle that had started everything. You never knew when you might need to break something important. The revolution that began with improvised weapons and unconventional thinking had become the coalition's greatest strategic advantage. And it all started because someone forgot to put away a piece of cleaning equipment. Sometimes the most significant changes came from the most ordinary beginnings. Marcus had learned that lesson well, and now he was teaching it to the galaxy. The drill was simple, the implications were profound, and the humans were just getting started.